Vampires, the so-called children of the night, and sometimes referred to as the progeny of the biblical Cain. Vampires are almost ubiquitous in works of speculative fiction, from the erudite vampire counts of Warhammer Fantasy, the classy and sexy creatures in the works of Anne Rice, to the cool and awe-inspiring Blood Angel Space Marine chapter of Warhammer 40,000. Heck, we've even discussed some of the vampires found in the works of legendary horror writer Stephen King, who has only added more to the legacy of the bloodthirsty and blood-drinking beings of Slavic folklore and mythology. There was also a series of books about vampires who sparkled when sunlight hit them, but I don't really want to talk about them. Anyway, this time around, I'd like to discuss with you the stories of vampires, or at least alleged vampires who can be found in history. We shall talk about them and the legends surrounding them. Hi, hello, and welcome again everybody to another episode of Natural Juan. Get ready guys, as this time we'll be talking about the so-called vampires of history, which include Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Dracula, Elizabeth Bathory or the Blood Countess, and Mercy Brown of Rhode Island. Before all that though, I'd like to dedicate this video to Jenny Notarte, the vampire of my high school days, and Aryan Paltep, the vampire of her own class. Special shout out too to Mr. Jonathan Green, my patron in Patreon. If you would like to see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that bell for notifications. Also, if you want to support my channel and what I do here, you can check out my Patreon information in the description below, which also contains info for PayPal and Gcash for making quick, one-time donations. Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's take a bite out of history's real-world vampires. First on our list is Vlad III, better known as Vlad the Impaler, and remembered forever in literature as Count Dracula. Born somewhere around 1431, Vlad III was the second son of Vlad II of Wallachia. Early on, the Ottoman Empire conquered the region of Wallachia and took both Vlad III and his younger brother Radu as hostages in order to ensure the loyalty of Vlad II. Things took a turn for the worst for House Draculesti when John Hunyadi, regent governor of Hungary at the time, invaded Wallachia and murdered both Vlad II and Mircea, Vlad III's eldest brother, in order to take control of the region. Hunyadi then installed Vladislav II, cousin of Vlad III, to become Wallachia's current ruler. Later on, around 1456, Vlad III returned to Wallachia to take back the land for himself, which was, in a way, his birthright. Vladislav II had lost favor with the Hungarians who supported him during the initial part of his rulership, and Vlad III was quick to find allies among his cousin's former supporters. In the end, with Vladislav II dead and Vlad III's reign secured, the latter earned the name the Impaler when he hunted down and gathered together all his enemies and anyone who opposed him, and had them impaled on spikes. This was not the only atrocities Vlad III was infamous for, however, as he had also been known to take enemies of the state and those deemed unfit to lavished rooms, which would then be quickly burned down. Vlad III would then die of mysterious circumstances somewhere between the years of 1476 and 1477, either by an assassin's weapon or was slain in battle. Today, Vlad III is best remembered for being the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, and many tend to think more of the vampire than the extreme but nonetheless nationalistic man that he really was. To put things in perspective, Vlad III is considered a hero by the Romanian people because he was willing to make himself look like a monster to his enemies just so they would leave his people alone. While certainly brutal in his methods, he was probably no different from many rulers of his time who knew too well what happened to nations with weak monarchs. Vlad III did indeed have a terrifying reputation that he probably helped create, but then one must ask, how much of the stories about him were true, and which ones were actually just fabricated to aid in his monstrous image? Another individual who is also thought to have inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula is Elizabeth Bathory of Hungary, better known as the Blood Countess. Born in August 7, 1560 in near Bator, Royal Hungary, she was a sickly noblewoman who often suffered from seizures and may have been afflicted with epilepsy. Much like Vlad III, Elizabeth Bathory lived during a time of seemingly unceasing conflict which involved the Ottoman Empire, the Catholic kingdoms of Europe, at the time and the ever-growing numbers of Protestants. Needless to say, the young countess' life must have been no doubt turbulent, as she probably witnessed countless and brutal retributions among the warring factions of her land at the time. Elizabeth Bathory would later be remembered as a vicious serial killer, when she and a number of her servants would be accused of killing hundreds of girls and bathing in their blood. It was thought that she did this in the hope that the virgin's blood she bathed in would heal her of her ailments, which included that of her seizures, and some even claimed that she looked younger each time she did this. With her husband Ferenc Nadasdy away, leading Hungary's forces against the Ottoman Empire at the time, Elizabeth Bathory was the de facto ruler of her estate, and few dared to question her reign. It was only when rumors of her atrocities spread that Elizabeth Bathory would be investigated and then arrested for the alleged murder of some 300 girls and women. Servants of the noblewoman who were loyal to her were executed, but Elizabeth Bathory herself was imprisoned in Castle Chete, her home with her husband, and died a lonely death in August 21, 1614, when she was aged 54. Again, like Vlad III, Elizabeth Bathory is not without her modern supporters. There are those who insist that the charges levied against her were all fabricated to put her out of the way of certain would-be rulers. There have been even reports of the Countess supporting destitute women and victims of rape, leading some to think of her as a strong female figure among Hungarians. That said, she doesn't seem to have as much support as Vlad III, and many still agree that she was a cruel noblewoman, as evidenced by the large number of corpses of female victims found in or near Castle Chete. Last on our list is the case of Mercy Brown, who, unlike the first two mentioned here, is not of noble birth nor a European. Mercy Brown was one of 3 children among the Brown family in Exeter, Rhode Island. Born somewhere in 1873, there's really little to be said about Mercy, save for the fact that she died of tuberculosis, which, at the time, was poorly understood. Members of her family died one by one, including herself, until it was only her brother, Edwin Brown, fell ill with a deadly disease. Born into a community of farmers who were mostly uneducated, the neighbors of the Brown family assumed that Edwin was under some kind of spiritual attack and believed that he was the victim of a vampire. The corpses of his family members, including George Brown, Edwin's father, Mary Brown, Edwin's mother, Mary Olive Brown, Edwin's older sister, and Mercy, his youngest sister, were then exhumed to see if one of them displayed strange or possibly even supernatural properties. It was then discovered that Mercy Brown's body displayed very little decomposition, and many villagers assumed that she was indeed a vampire and burned both her heart and liver in the hopes of saving Edwin, who, around that time, was already dying of tuberculosis. That said, despite the efforts of the friends of the Brown family, Edwin Brown later died and joined his family in the grave. Unlike the first two mentioned, there is little debate on Mercy Brown's history, even if there is scant information on her. She was, at best, just another woman from New England trying to live her life as best she could until her family was afflicted by tuberculosis, which would later be also called the consumption. Her being mistaken for a vampire was just the result of people at the time being uneducated, superstitious, and the world at large still knowing very little just what kind of disease tuberculosis was. In any case, let us just be grateful today that people have a better grasp on medical science, and that cases of tuberculosis have dwindled in more developed parts of the world and continues to plummet in other places. Let us be hopeful then that through science and human determination, that the great plague of today will also meet a similar fate and just be another part of human history. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Natural Juan. If you would like to see more content like this, please feel free to subscribe to my channel and hit that bell for notifications. If you would also like to support my channel and what I do here, you may check out my Patreon, PayPal, and Gcash info in the description below. Natural Juan,